Story 1. My brother has struggled with a substance dependency for most of his life. About 5 years ago, it tore his family apart. His wife filed for divorce and was awarded full custody of their son. This is all right and proper, as my brother was in no condition to be a father at this time. The road to recovery has been long, but my brother has been working the program and has now been clean for several years. He has no formal custody of his son, though he gets visitation at his ex-wife's discretion. He's been a good and stable father to his son in the last years. However, his ex has not wanted to allow for the possibility that brother has become well. In fact, she has begun jerking him around with visitation, even planning on removing her son from his father for a period of several months so she can take a long vacation with her new family. Brother, not willing to let this slide, immediately filed for joint custody. The court case was just a day ago, and as expected, his ex has bad-mouthed his former substance abuse and attempted to paint him as still dependent and a threat to their son again. He totally is not. He has been clean for years, employed, and owning his own home now. The ex was so self-deluded and confident that he had backslid, that she loudly demanded, in front of the judge, that my brother provide a letter from the local president of the substance counseling program stating that he has attended every meeting for the last several years. My brother smiled at the judge and said, "Not only is that not a problem, Your Honor, but I can provide that document today." The judge asked how this is possible. Did his brother already think to bring it with him? "No, Your Honor, but you see, I am the president of our local chapter." I wish I could see the look on that hateful woman's face. It's not official yet, but yeah, he's totally getting joint custody. Story 2. My boss was brought up in a household where the solution to being cold was putting another jumper on, to the extent the inside of the windows used to freeze. Lord knows how many times I have heard that story. Unfortunately, instead of reveling in the marvel that is central heating, my boss feels it necessary to impose the same draconian rules straight from the 18th century on all of us in the office. In a word, it gets darn cold at work. For context, I work in a converted barn which is both poorly insulated and has a tall vaulted roof. This means any heat dissipates upwards and the building generally needs a lot of heat to stay comfortable. It is not uncommon to sit indoors wearing my small down jacket and thermal base layers to keep warm. If I was working outside, I could accept this, but in an office environment, it's unnecessary. To make matters worse, I suffer from Raynaud's, which has been getting worse for the last few years. My condition makes it really rather miserable to sit at work for 8 hours with numb fingers and toes, all because of the lack of proper heating in the middle of winter. I am a long-standing employee, but in all my time working for my company, there has always been another colleague with a far more vocal opinion on how warm the office should be. For the last few years, for instance, a colleague of mine would make a big parade about cranking the heating up to 24 degrees C multiple times a day. This resulted in a daily tit-for-tat between my colleague and boss. Typically, my boss would see the thermostat, exclaim it's too hot, and switch the boiler off at the mains. No heat. I tried in vain to convince my colleague to leave the heating at a reasonable level, say 19 to 20 degrees C, as I was certain my boss was unable to actually tell the heating was set higher than his preferred 15 degrees C unless he could visually see the stat set higher. I was ignored, the tit-for-tat continued, and so did the cold. Roll forward a few years, I am now the only person left in the office other than my boss, his son, and an administrator who works part-time. The temperature has started to drop and the cold has been drawing in. The heating was switched on Monday this week and like clockwork set bang on 15 degrees C. I decided enough was enough and sat down with my boss to discuss the heating. I explained how cold temperatures affect my Raynaud's and asked if he would be willing to increase the thermostat. Surprisingly, my boss was pretty compassionate and promised to increase the heating starting the very next day. True to his word, my boss did increase the thermostat by 1 flipping degree. Apparently 16 degrees C was his limit. To say I was livid was an understatement, but more disheartening was looking towards another winter shivering at my keyboard. I couldn't stand the thought, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. 2 really important bits of information popped into my head that morning that formed the perfect plot in an instant. The thermostat was old school, analog, not digital. My boss and his son were out at a meeting for the whole afternoon, and the admin wasn't due in at all. Roll on lunchtime. I took it upon myself to research the model of thermostat. I found an archived manual online. Page 3 calibration. I couldn't believe how simple it was to adjust the unit. There was one screw to remove the outer casing which exposed the dial. The dial then simply lifts off the spindle and is rotated and reinserted onto the spindle to calibrate the unit. Armed with my Swiss Army knife, once I was alone in the office, I got to work. Disassembling the unit, I rotated the spindle clockwise by 4 degrees. So now when set at 16 degrees C, the thermostat would actually measure 20 degrees C. I replaced the casing and using a relative humidity meter we use for work, I tested the switching point of the stat. The office measured at 16.2 degrees C, and the stat clicked on around 12 degrees C. Hearing the boiler fire in the kitchen gave me the biggest grin I have had in ages. That was on Tuesday. The remainder of the week has been glorious. For the first time in 8 years, the office is actually at a constant, comfortable temperature. I had been waiting to post this in line with the rules as no fallout had occurred. However, this afternoon my boss asked if I was warm enough, again unusually compassionate. While I felt kinda bad to go behind his back, it does give me scope to increase the heating even more when it starts getting really cold in the next few months. I was also pretty ecstatic as it proved the hunch I have had for years. My boss has no idea if the heating is set warmer, other than the number shown on the stat. So an all-out win for my bit of malicious compliance. Story 3. I run the parts room at an independently owned auto body and collision repair shop. We'll call the owners Mr. and Mrs. Bossman. We do mostly insurance repairs and always have between 20 and 50 vehicles on property in various states of repair, depending on how busy we are. Once the estimate for a specific vehicle is approved, my job is primarily to order all the parts for the repair, track and receive and organize all the parts for all ongoing repairs as they arrive, input the invoicing and process any returns for wrong/damaged/unnecessary parts and such. Plus information technology work, because apparently, I'm the only person there who knows you can just Google a problem and somebody has usually already posted the answer on a message board from 6 years ago. I complain a lot, but in actuality, I very much like my job and I've become exceedingly good at it over the years. My coworkers are generally pretty great. There's almost no office drama. I don't usually deal with the general public and the owners are mostly solid bosses, a husband and wife team. Mr. Bossman runs the day-to-day shop, and he is there on site pretty much every day, while Mrs. Bossman comes in periodically to do the books, which she watches like a hawk. Mr. Bossman is a decent guy so far as bosses go, but Mrs. Bossman is great. She's just one of those high personality types who's all peaches and sunshine and rainbows 90% of the time, right up until the moment something doesn't go entirely her way. At which point she drops the smile and becomes the stubbornest immovable object you've ever butted heads against. May God help you if you actually anger her. She's not a Karen in the slightest, she's just an elemental force of nature, and you can bend like the reed or break like the twig. So I deal with Mr. Bossman on a daily basis and only deal with Mrs. Bossman a few times a week when she needs something for accounting. My default work ethic used to be set to sack of potatoes. But that doesn't fly with the Bossmans, and especially not Mrs. Bossman. I have learned the hard way to be very, very proactive in my duties, which is directly why I'm now a great parts guy. Didn't take long to find out that it's just far easier and safer to be able to redirect the coming storm with knowledge and paper trails than it is to face the fury head-on with laziness and ignorance. She always says, the 3 most important rules to follow in this industry are 1. Cover your behind. 2. Cover your behind, and 3, cover your behind, to which I'd add a 4th rule. Always send an email beginning with, per our phone call, I'd just like to remind you. Always have an email, saved my behind so many times, becomes relevant later, and she freaking loves me because I have become exceedingly excellent at making her job easier through diligent bookkeeping. As you also might imagine, doing all this ordering and invoicing and emailing and such demands heavy use of a computer. And for years I had to make do with one that was never built nor intended for the task. It wasn't even very old, just an underpowered tablet-style budget computer originally only meant for the shop foreman to occasionally check estimates. At any given time I had to run our estimating software plus 2 to 4 price matching programs and their accompanying background scanning programs plus multiple Chrome windows for email and parts vendors and parts finder websites. plus image software to view repair photos or edit diagrams to email back and forth. The budget computer had 2 gigs of RAM and a dual-core 1.3 GHz processor. It could barely handle running Notepad if you had the main estimating software running, and it made my job painfully slow, even at the best of times. For 4 years, I'd mention it to Mrs. Bossman, and it was always, "Oh right, I keep meaning to look into that," and then nothing. But that was better than bringing it up with Mr. Bossman. Mr. Bossman was a former repair technician before they opened their own shop together, so anything on the office end is already good enough until it breaks and not worth wasting more money on in his eyes. All the upgrades should be on the production side of the shop since that's what he knows well. She's much more practical about office upgrades, thankfully. Anytime I'd mention how slow my computer was and how much it was slowing down my work, he'd just laugh it off and say, "It does the job, don't it?" and walk away far too pleased with himself. Mrs. Bossman had been going back and forth with a specific vendor that was arguing against some outstanding credits and unpaid invoices that didn't match our numbers, which means they don't match my numbers. So she came into my office to ask me to look into them as normal. But today is not normal. It's especially busy, and I'm already a day behind where I should be. Cue malicious compliance. This time I decided that unlike normal, my workload was light enough LOL that I totally had the time right then and there and could look them up for her right on the spot, instead of bringing here the files later that day. This seemed urgent after all, so I began searching our database for the problem invoices, and very deliberately and thoroughly went through every program I possibly could, opening every estimate and reconciliation and digital footprint to pull up any scrap of even slightly relevant information for her, so that she had all the relevant info to argue with the vendor. Each new screen freezing and pausing and loading anew. Each new refresh taking more of those long-form time-dilated seconds to complete. Those seconds that drag on and on and on like waiting for a traffic light to turn. I was just being properly diligent, you must understand. "Oh, here it is," I'd say in my most matter-of-fact, perfectly normal, everything is fine and standard and typical voice. "Yeah, that part was returned back on." "Huh, oh let me pull up the credit memo." "Oh, actually that just shows when I generated the return but not when the vendor actually took it back. Actually, I remember this one now. The driver didn't leave a return confirmation slip, so I think I sent the vendor a reminder email about that. Let me pull that up. Yes, I told them about the issue 2 months ago. And this is a follow-up email that was part of another chain. Let me forward you both of those. And actually, I think I can still pull up the estimate here since it has the full reconciliation. I hope it didn't freeze completely. Just wait a sec, and it usually catches back up." She kept her smile up, but I could tell it had shifted, and she was getting annoyed. "Does it always take you this long to look up the invoices?" I could tell she was getting really impatient. But she couldn't say anything about it since I was doing exactly what she just asked of me, and she does normally love that I'm this thorough, so long as she's not waiting in real time. "Huh? Oh yeah, this is normally like this," I said casually. "It's kind of frustrating sometimes, but Mr. Bossman doesn't want to buy another computer since this one does technically do everything I need it to do, perfectly innocent moon eyes. It doesn't slow me down too much. Not usually, blink, blink, puppy dog face." I continued doing this for all 5 or so problem invoices, and honestly, it was a 100% typical thing to look up and really only took maybe 15 minutes total in the end. The only difference was making a big show of it, while intentionally making it look like I wasn't making a show of it. But that was enough. "Well, I really think we need to look into getting you a new computer. This can't be good for production turnarounds if it's always being this slow." Huge success. Storm of Fury successfully redirected from self to vendor, armed with time-stamped acknowledgements for every rogue charge, and finally knowing the crap I have to sit through each and every time I double-click. With all the invoices and credits properly tracked on our end, the vendor's accounting had to admit the mess-up had been on their end, and we had been billed in error. I'm not always right, but even when I'm wrong, I can usually pull up a time-dated email to make it look like I wasn't wrong. Bend a little, and the hurricane may just pass you by for a less prepared target. She waited a few weeks to find a good deal. But sure enough, I had a new computer shortly thereafter that is much more capable of running everything I need to run without derping out on me, and it's been an absolute champion. Decided to write this because it's been almost exactly 2 years working on the new machine that's still going strong. and today I got an unrequested raise for good performance, so I'm feeling overly pleased with myself.